Hi, I'm Raison, and this is how I fish the Pellet Waggler. Well, you join me here today at Gold Valley on Syndicate Lake, and it's the perfect place to show you how I fish the Pellet Waggler. And the number one thing I want to talk to you about is deciding when to fish the Pellet Waggler, not wasting time, especially in matches when the conditions aren't right. Number one, obviously it's got to be warm. The fish have got to be up on the surface. It's no point fishing deep on a Pellet Waggler because all you tend to do is foul hook the fish, and a ledger or a bomb is a much better option. But today it's nice and warm, flat calm, and I can see fish all over the surface, which are the signs I'm looking for when I'm going to catch and use a Pellet Waggler. Obviously when you're loose feeding on a Pellet Waggler, 8mm pellets are the number one bait. 6mm are too small, 11mm are too big. They go too far, make too big a splash. 8mm, always concentrate on using them. I normally always use them on the hook as well, on the hair. Sometimes if the water's on the clear side, I will use a wafter, but 99% of the time, and certainly today, I'm going to be using an 8mm pellet. Loose feeding them, looking for swirls, looking for signs that there's fish up in those surface layers, and always working hard. The one thing you'll notice about Pellet Waggler fishing, the guy that catches the most is normally the guy that's working the hardest. And by that I mean normally, you know, if you're not casting, playing a fish or loose feeding, you're not working hard enough. It's not for the faint-hearted, and it's certainly not for the lazy angler. So always keep your work rate high. Like I say, on hard days you might get a bite every 30 or 40 casts. On good days, you know, you might get a bite every 5 or 6 casts. And it's important to remember with the Pellet Waggler, a massive percentage of your bites will come as your float lands. So the more times your float lands, you can do the maths, the more bites you're going to get. Like I say, it is a deadly method, not just here at Gold Valley, on all commercials throughout the country. It counts for some massive weights. There's various different ways of fishing a Pellet Waggler. You can fish a big waggler where you're not feeding. You can fish a little dobbing waggler casting at fish. But today I'm going to show you how I fish what I call the conventional Pellet Waggler, which is loose feeding 8mm pellets, casting just beyond, anticipating a bite, twitching it in and feeding, but working really hard, like I say, with those 8mm pellets. I need to talk to you about the tackle and your choice of tackle. Obviously, like I've already said, the Pellet Waggler accounts for some massive weights, and you don't always catch them all the way through the match. Quite often your window of opportunity is limited to 2 to 3 hours. So your tackle needs to be very strong and durable. Not just to catch one big fish, but to catch a number of small fish, smaller carp, very quick, and you don't want your gear letting you down. For today's session, I've set up an 11-foot tournament rod. Again, 11 foot, where you're working hard and you're in and out. You need to have a rod that feels like an extension of your arm. The 11-foot tournament's light, stiff, and very strong, ticks all the boxes for me. 3000 tournament reel, coupled with 8-pound line. Again, very strong, very durable. It's not going to snap on the strike. It's not going to let me down when I have fed for like 2 or 3 hours. Eventually I've got fish in my peg. Now it's time to win the match and my line breaks. I don't want that to happen. Obviously when you're up in the main line, a very important part is the float. You do need a float that casts absolutely perfectly when you're using heavier mainline. All floats will cast well with 2 and 3 and 4 pound mainline, but then you haven't got the durability and the reliability of the heavy mainline. The setup itself's quite simple. 3 float stops, a little bit of a gap of about 2 inches, 1 float stop above the float, 3 below. That just stops the float from sliding down when you're casting very hard, especially if you do have any adverse weather conditions. The main line goes down. I've got a 2.5 foot hook length of 0.20. The main line's 0.22. Very strong Gunsmoke hypersensor. Big loops, again, I'm looking for big loops that sink slightly slower, going to keep that bait momentarily higher in the water. Again, like I've said, I'm targeting the fish in the upper layers. I just want to talk to you a little bit about the float. This is a Dawa Carper Pellet Waggler float, which I've helped design with Dawa. It's along the lines of the floats that I've made for myself for around about 18 or 19 years now. The advantage with these are you can use heavy mainline. They cast ever so well. You can achieve the distance that you do need to. You want to be out in the lake. You don't want to be fishing short, 25 metres, 27 metres, that sort of distance, out in the lake, trying to dominate your little area. And you do need the right float. Like I say, the setup that I've come up with over the years with the float, no swivel on the line, because that's going to make your rig obviously sink a lot faster. Hook wise, it's a size 14, which is a big 14. A little bit of fluff on the line there, just show you that. Size 14 Guru Pellet Waggler hook to 020 tournament rig line. Again, the line very durable, the whole setup, it's just not going to let me down. And I've been in the situation where I've knocked my main line down so my floats cast slightly better, and all that happens is you get snapped a little bit more. Like I say, I will touch on the floats a little bit more in depth later on, but all in all, that's the setup. Like I say, 8mm pellets, a good strong catapult as well is an absolute must. But you'll see when we actually start fishing that it is about work rate. This isn't a lazy method. It's not like, you know, you can cast a feeder out and wait. You need to be feeding, you need to be casting, and hopefully you need to be playing a few fish. Like I say, the conditions are absolutely bang on. There's a few fish moving. I think we'll get an odd bite. Like I said at the beginning of this little talk, I think it's vitally important when you're looking at fishing matches to be on the Pellet Waggler on the right conditions. Obviously you're looking for flat calm conditions, you're looking for hot conditions, but also there's little telltale signs to be aware of when you're in a match. When you're loose feeding pellets, always keep an eye out for any swirls on the surface, any fish bow waving. And another good tip, if you're on a bomb or you're on a pole but you're loose feeding a waggler, always keep an eye out for what other people are catching on. If there's a guy opposite you or next to you or just up from you catching on a pellet waggler, then quite often it can be worth a go. Because these fish, this time of year, you get that 5-10 minutes of sunshine and they'll come straight up and they're more than willing to feed in the surface areas. And they're big fish, game changers, fish that are going to win you the match. So I've shown you the setup. Like I say, I will talk about the floats a little bit more in depth later on, but I think it's time to get a little bit of bait in and try and get a bite or two. Right, so here I am on the box, ready to start fishing. There's a couple of things before I cast out I just want to make you aware of that are very important. In the sequence I use, so to start the sequence I'm going to be casting just past where I'm loose feeding, holding the rod, anticipating a bite for around 15 seconds. Then I'm going to have a couple of turns which brings the float into the fed area and the bait back up, and then I'm going to put the rod down. And this is very important to get this bit dead right. You always want a slight angle on your rod, so when you put your rod down to loose feed, if you do get a bite now, it's going to pull your rod and the bend of your rod is going to absorb the bite. You don't want it straight, because if that happens, you get a bite, it's just going to go snap and that's the end of it. So always have a nice angle just so that your rod can get pulled. You can drop your catapult and pick your rod up. One other thing that's vitally important in getting this correct is having your tip of your rod just touching the water. When I move my float, I don't want any slack line. If my rod's out the water by a foot or under the water by a foot, that's creating slack line either going down or coming up. With your tip just touching the water, there's no slack line. If your float goes, the fish is going to hook itself straight away on the rod. Very important. Only a couple of little things, but very important. I've already got a pellet on, so to achieve the correct distance, it's a nice strong firm cast. I don't want to overcast though, which is why we brought out the 3 different sizes in these wagglers. I've got the 7 gram one on at the moment. When there's hardly any wind, it's absolutely the perfect weight to go just past where I'm loose feeding those pellets. Now there's many different ways. People might agree with the way that I do it, the sequence as I like to call it, but I've tried all the different ways, feeding, then casting, various different things, and this is a sequence I always go back to, and it couldn't really be simpler. So I'm going to cast the float out. I've always got a far bank marker. That's about 2 meters past where I'm actually going to feed. I'm holding the rod, I'm not putting the rod down, I'm anticipating that bite. A big percentage of your bites when you're pellet waggler fishing will come as your float lands. Now that's my first chance of getting a bite, and the sequence I use always gives me 2 bites of the cherry. The float's landed, I've not had a bite. I can just make that line straight, put it down. Now I'm not even looking at the float. That float's come into where I've been loose feeding, loose feed around it, and that was my second chance of a bite. And then I'm repeating the process again. Very important, if you use this sequence, what it does, it keeps you busy. You're not sat there just looking at a motionless float. You're trying to make things happen. So again, cast past my bait, I'm holding the rod, anticipating that bite. A lot of your bites will come within 5 or 6 seconds of that float landing. Give it that 10, 15 seconds, everything's settled, no signs, back into my bait, rod down at that angle, looking at the tip. I'm not looking at the float, loose feed, around the float, and then back in. And this is what it's about. I've said before, pellet waggler fishing rewards the people that work the hardest. And this is the sort of work rate you need. Again, holding the rod. A lot of the bites will come like now. That's when you're looking to get that bite, as your float's landed, fish comes to the noise, no signs. I can just bring that in to the fed area. Again, I'm just watching the rod. I'm getting the pellets in the catapult, loose feed, and then in. A couple of other things that are vitally important. I speak a lot about a lot of bites coming as soon as your float lands, and it's very important when your float lands that it doesn't move. It lands and it stays exactly in the vicinity of where your float landed. If your float starts to land and you move it back towards you slightly, you're moving your hook bait away from the noise that it's made. And it's the noise that's going to attract the fish. It's the noise that's going to get you that bite immediately as your float lands. And you can see the work rate, and all of a sudden, and I keep telling people with the pellet waggler, it's work rate, work rate, work rate. And all of a sudden you're cast out after maybe 10, 15, 20 casts, your float goes and you've got a fish. And then it all becomes worthwhile. That work rate, you know, the constant feeding, the constant twitching, the constant recasting. And also, if you use this sort of, I refer to it all the time as a sequence, you're feeding all the time. So now I'm going to run you through the new Daiwa Carper pellet wagglers that are modelled on a float that I've been making for around about 15 years. You really do need the correct float when you're pellet waggler fishing. A float that not only flies straight, but flies far enough with heavy, durable mainline. And what we've achieved with the new Daiwa Carper pellet wagglers, you can see there, are 3 floats, 7, 9 and 11 grams, which are not only the weights that I've used over the years and the weights of the floats that I've handmade, but also the length. The length of the float is very, very important as far as casting and not spooking fish when it's out there. Bearing in mind, you know, you're looking at catching these fish in the surface layers, you need a float that's going to land nice and quietly, not spook the fish and not be too long. I'm just going to pick one out and talk you through what I think the reasons are that make this float much, much better than anything else you can buy on the market. As you can see, it's got a look of like a handmade float. A little bit tidier than the ones I used to make, but all in all, basically the same float. You've got adjustable weights, you've got the anti-dive discs. More importantly than anything, on this part of the float, there's no weight. Any weight in the tip end of the float is going to make the float waggle, not cast as straight, and obviously not cast as far. So when you get your hands on some of these floats, they will come dotted right down to the tip. You can obviously adjust the weight because it will unscrew, but for me, you want to leave maximum loading on the float. This will make the float cast, like I say, absolutely dead straight and a long way. If you start taking loading off, so you've got more float showing, the float isn't going to cast as well. The buoyancy of the balsa that's used will be enough, even though the float is dotted right down, it will be enough to suspend like a wafter or an 8mm pellet, so there's no need to worry about that. So like I say, if I was you, just leave the float exactly how you get it from the shop, and it will perform much better than if you do start taking some of the weights off of the bottom. And what we've achieved with minimal paint, minimal material making the actual flights, and like I say, a very thin but very hard varnish, for me has achieved the perfect float. You'll see when I start fishing just how well they cast with heavy durable mainline. I keep repeating myself, but it's of utmost importance that your gear doesn't let you down on these commercials when you've got the chance of catching a big weight. But you do need the correct float, and that is exactly what we've achieved with the new Dawa Carper Pellet Wagglers. Depth wise, while I've got the rig in my hand, always start at about 4 foot. Obviously some commercials are slightly shallower, but 3.5 to 4 foot for me is a brilliant starting depth. Yes, I will go a little bit deeper, but for me, the days to fish deeper aren't necessarily when the fish are deeper, it's when the fish are spooking away from the float. I'm very wary about hanging my bait out there deep, foul hooking fish that I could easily catch on a bomb. That's my go-to depth. A little bit of a gap between the two float stops, and like I say, just keep that work rate up. I just want to talk a little bit about actual feeding in a match. Obviously 8mm pellets, you know, you can achieve as a bite then. You will miss an odd bite. In gold now, in Syndicate, we've got quite a few new fish which are like 2.5 to 5 pound, which are a little bit cute sometimes. And you can just get that little dink on your float, as well as some roach and some bream, which you can get pestered a little bit. But going back to the actual feeding, at the beginning of a match, I always like to be a little bit more aggressive. Not so much with regularity, but volumes when I do feed. That way, early on in a match, I can tend to bottle a few fish up, get a bit of bait on the bottom as well. It's always good to get a little bit of fizzing going. Not only when you want to go on a bomb later in the match, you're going to catch some. And ultimately for me, aggressive feeding is the #1 way early in a match to get them in your peg. One little tip that I want to give away that I've used for many years, and it's about feeding accurately 8mm pellets in open water. If you get to a commercial and you've got an island or a far bank to aim at, obviously that makes your accuracy a lot easier. You can feed in the same place using the far bank or an island or a point as a marker. On bigger commercials like Gold Valley here, you haven't got that luxury. And what you don't want to be doing is loose feeding all over the place. And one brilliant little trick that I use, rather than stretch my catapult to my right, I'm going to hold it in front of me, touch my stomach with the pouch, fully extend my arm, and then fire the pellets. And because the pellets are all the same size and I'm pulling my catapult back the same distance, you can see there that they're all going in exactly the same place. With your arm fully extended, holding the pouch against yourself, you can't fire them any shorter, you can't fire them any further. Yeah, wind will play a little bit of a part, but if you stick to those rules, you're going to feed a lot more accurately. Ultimately then you can cast past your bait a lot more accurately, and when you do go on a lead, you can cast right in amongst those pellets and you're feeding in the same place. It's only a small tip, but for me it's vitally important. See there, just hold the pouch against myself, let go, and I'm feeding absolutely in the same place every time. Like I say, they're only small little tips, like the angle on your rod tip touching the surface, feeding in the same place, but they all add up. And if you can do them all in the same sequence, you're going to catch a lot more fish. There's an odd fish moving out there now. There you go. There's one. Straight under that bite. Absolutely fantastic fishing. Work rate again. Keep feeding, keep casting. Don't think it's a massive carp, this one. Yeah, nice little mirror. Whoop, lively one. There we go. Yes. When you get the fish in the net, good little tip, obviously the back wind's on. Always reach down, just click the back wind on. That'll lock the reel and save any over spillage and tangles. That one's come off in the net, perfect. In the net. Again, as I'm going along, I'm just picking up on little things, little tips that I want to share with you. And you can see there, I've just netted a fish. And what I do in a match now, because I want to keep that bait going in. I want to keep the noise, I want to keep bait going in. My pellets come off my hair, but before I actually put a new pellet on and cast back out, I want to feed a couple of times. I want to keep that regularity of bait going in, which is ultimately going to keep those fish in my peg, in the surface layers and on the bottom. I'm all ready to cast out again now. Just past the fed area. There you go. Absolutely textbook pellet waggler fishing. And that's why when you cast initially and your float lands, for me, people might disagree, never put your rod down. You saw then, literally, the float landed and it was gone. So many people, they cast out, put the rod down, the float goes under, pops back up, and you can see them scrambling for their rod. That's your best chance. Every single cast is within 5 to 7 seconds of that float landing. So you need to hold that rod, anticipating that bite. Not the biggest one in Syndicate Lake by a mile, but it's all bites, and you can see how well the sequence and the tactics are working. And the best thing about it all is we've not really mentioned the float, because we don't have to, because the float is doing everything it needs to be doing. Again, click the back wind on. I can't get any overrun on my reel. Everything's locked, and I can just unhook the fish. I'm not going to get in any tangles. So lively. Bang. In the net. And again, work rate. Always remember the work rate. I'm going to feed a couple of times to my marker, far bank marker, holding the pouch against my chest. Pellets are going to go in exactly the same place every time. Pick a real nice, well-formed pellet out. Always take your time as well. There's times to rush and there's times to be quick, and then there's times just to get it absolutely dead right. Always make sure that pellet band is nice and central, sitting perfect. A quick look at the setup, everything's good. Back out, just past my bait, and just start the whole sequence again. You might get a bite immediately, it might be in 20 casts time, but just keep going, keep going, keep going. Just move that into my bait and just look at my rod tip. Just feed and back in. Again, every time I come in, I'm just casting one eye over my rig, just checking that my hook's sitting right. You see then one of the float stops had just slid up a tiny bit. Just manoeuvring it all the time, but trying to be as fast and efficient as I can. I want that float to land as many times as possible. I want to twitch it into my bait and then obviously feed as regularly and as accurately as I can, and just keep working, and you'll see, I'm sure, with this, the way the fish are, within 10 casts you probably get another opportunity. There was a bite then straight away. Pulled the line again. Again, after every missed bite, just checking everything's hanging dead right. Just past my bait. Such exciting fishing. It's, you know, you can go 10, 15, 20 casts without a bite, and then literally your float lands and it's gone. Such explosive fishing. And like I've already said, it accounts for some massive weights. Goes hand in hand with ledger fishing absolutely perfectly. And it really is, in my mind, one of the most deadly, yes, brilliant fishing. It really is a deadly way of fishing, but I keep repeating myself, the harder you work, the more bites you're going to get, the more chances you're going to get. And by following the routine of casting, moving your float, feeding, reeling in, casting, moving your float, feeding, you're keeping that float landing, which, as you've seen today, is the number one time you're going to get a bite. Nearly all the carp we caught today have been within 5 or 7 seconds of that float landing. So the more time your float lands, I'm not a mathematician, but I can do that one. The more times your float lands, the more chances you've got. You can imagine if we were next to each other in a match, in a 5-hour match, if you have 50 casts and I have 300, who's going to get the most bites? Quite simple. Again, the same routine, backwind, locked, fish in, unhook the fish, in the net. I just pop the hook gently into my trousers, it's not going to go anywhere. Keeping that feed rate up. It really is, when you follow the guidelines of holding the pouch against yourself, fully extending your arm every time the same way, it is amazing how accurate you can feed. This can come into play even more in the winter, when obviously there's a lot more bomb fishing. It really is a real good little trick to keep your accuracy and to keep your bait going in the same place. It's nothing worse than, you know, having one of those days where you're feeding all over the shop and you just feel, you know, halfway through a match you've almost blown your peg, purely because you've, there you go. Now if you see that one, perfect that. The last fish we caught was on the first bite of the cherry, so to speak. Cast out, hold your rod, anticipate that bite. That one was on the second bite of the cherry. So every single cast I'm giving myself 2 chances, when my float lands and then when I twitch it back in. And that one, I twitched it back in, went to pick my catapult up, and with the bend in the rod, or the angle in the rod, the robs absorbed it. I could just see the rod going around, just drop the catapult and pick the rod up. Vitally important you create that little angle. Definitely a better fish, this one as well. Got to watch him under this bush. Definitely a better fish. But with that angle in the rod, the carp, not only the angle in the rod, but the fact that the rod tip's just touching the water, there's no slack. That carp's literally picked that pellet up, tightened up, felt the tip and just moved off, and everything's hooked itself. If I'd have had a little bit of slack in that, it definitely wouldn't have hooked itself. So you can see the whole setup, every little aspect of not just the sequence we're doing fishing, but the actual setup itself, vitally important. trust me, when you go fishing, just make sure you get all the little things right for the pellet waggler, because there's no real big advantages, but you get 6 or 7 little things and they all add up to one big advantage. Yeah, not a massive fish, but bigger than the last couple. Probably a real good time for me to just touch on something that, again, a lot of people will know I go on and on and on about it, but the strength and durability of your main line. You can see here, you know, I've got a fish on that's probably 8 pound, nice big mirror, and I'm not taking any prisoners. I'm not playing it. I'm giving it enough respect, but I want to get the fish in. I want to land it quick because I want to get it unhooked and I want to feed and I want to start fishing again. And this is the importance of using heavy, durable, quality mainline. You don't want to be casting out and getting snapped when you strike on the bite. You don't want to be, you know, having to set up again with half hour to go when you've spent all day feeding and preparing your peg and the fish have rocked up. You can see there, beautiful mirror carp, probably about 7.5, 8 pound. But what's good, that one, like I say, it didn't have it as soon as the float landed. It had it on that twitch into the bait, the rod went round and everything worked in perfect harmony, as it should. Get everything right and you get a few fish in front of you, you're going to be dangerous. Well, there we are, we've reached the end of the session, and to be fair, it's been absolutely brilliant. Bites all the time. Just goes to show the importance of getting that sequence right. Even though the fish are here and feeding very well, you had to keep working. You know, the fish weren't sort of catching themselves. You really had to do it right and keep that work rate high. We've caught, I would have thought, well, a massive weight, I wouldn't like to say. The line's not let us down. The floats, like I say, they cast absolutely perfect. All in all, a fantastic day. When you go out pellet waggler fishing, try and remember all the little tips I've given you, from the accurate feeding to getting your rod position right when you put it down. And if you get a few fish in front of you with the right gear, the right floats and the right technique, you're going to catch a lot of fish.